Let's talk about group development. We're going to explore a foundational model that was put together by Bruce Tuckman, originating in the 1960s. Originally, it had 4 stages to it: forming, storming, norming, and performing. But later, some work with other colleagues added in the need for a 5th stage, which we call adjourning. Now, this model, when we typically read about it, looks pretty linear. And that linear model doesn't really account for how groups actually function. So instead, I want to explore a more visual model with you that will help us understand group development. The first stage is forming, and this is obviously when a group comes together. If it's a brand new group, all group members are going to be new and experiencing something that we call primary tension. You can kind of think of this as walking on eggshells a little bit, trying to figure out what topics we can talk about or what topics we have in common. And that type of unease that exists in the early stages of a group tends to go away pretty quickly. But it is a characteristic of forming that can sometimes start to shape the rest of the group process. As a group moves from forming, it's going to move into the next stage called storming. And in storming, we're going to experience something called secondary tension. And that's the tension that really is about group dynamics. Here there might be some tension about leadership and followership. There might also be some tension just around how we handle conflict and difference. So in this stage, groups are really trying to work through who they are and figure out their place. As we start to resolve that tension, we're also moving into norming. And this is the stage where groups start to figure out their roles and expectations, how the group will operate. The identity of the group becomes a lot more solidified. And norms play a really important part here. And that's because norms tell us what behavior is acceptable and what is not. And in norming, groups also tend to figure out, what are we going to do when norms are violated? How do we handle that? What's our process and our procedure? The next stage is performing, and this is really the reason why groups are brought together in the first place. What's the task that you need to accomplish? If you were in a group class here at PCC, you might be doing a community-based learning project. And in that, the performing part would be you going to do your service work with a community partner. So the performing is enacting the reason for the group or the goals that brought you together. What you'll notice is that storming and norming and performing have arrows that go between them in many directions. And this is because groups move back and forth between these stages as new things happen in the group. Maybe there was something about how you work together that wasn't talked about in norming, and then once that norm is violated, you end up back in some conflict and storming, so that then you need to work it out and develop a new process again in norming, so you can keep performing. Another thing to consider about this model is that sometimes group members leave or the entire group disbands, and that's where we get adjourning. Adjourning can have some issues. Sometimes people start to lose their sense of commitment or engagement to the group as they see adjourning being inevitable. And then sometimes groups start to develop a form of nostalgia for the group having worked together really well and might almost kind of have a sense of remorse that the group work is ending. So that's if a group is coming together for the first time. Something to also note is that new group members are introduced sometimes. And that's again why forming is a separate part from the storming, norming, and performing, because sometimes we introduce new group members and then we need to go through the process of figuring out our group identity, socializing a new group member, and so forth. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, the first thing is that group development is nonlinear. As we've seen in the model, groups move between different stages depending on what's happening in the group. So we'll inevitably see that it's pretty cyclical. Another thing we can take away is that forming involves primary tension, and that storming involves secondary tension. The key here is tension. Some groups like to avoid this because they're uncomfortable with conflict. But if we try to avoid the storming stage, we're bound to end up right back there because it's a really important part of groups. So storming is not a stage we can skip because, as the last takeaway we have is, conflict is a really natural and necessary part of groups. It's important for us to learn to work through conflict so that we can begin to build trust with each other, so that we recognize that when problems pop up, we're able to move through them and to resolve them effectively. So it's important to engage in the conflict and really engage in that storming part as a crucial piece of the group development process.